Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and our main topic tonight, the parallels and or lack thereof between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, since the start of the Russian invasion late February, many of you may have seen posts or political cartoons like these that ironically accuse the world of having a pro-Israel double standard while equating the Ukrainian resistance movement and that of Palestinian groups or individuals. And in that same vein, many comparing Israelis to the Russian military as, quote, violent occupying forces and foreign invaders. For example, activists contrasting the international response to people using Molotov cocktails in Ukraine and Palestinians who use them in Jerusalem against Israeli police or defense forces. Media personalities like Mehdi Hassan balking at Israeli condemnations of the invasion, sarcastically insinuating that Israel has no moral grounds to stand with the Ukrainians in their national struggle. And even Irish politicians calling out the supposed double standards.
You're happy to correctly use the most strong and robust language to describe the crimes against humanity of Vladimir Putin, but you will not use the same strength of language when it comes to describing Israel's treatment of the Palestinians.
So is there any legitimacy to these arguments? Here to discuss is Arab-Israeli social activist and CEO of Arevim Zelazeh, aka Together Vouch for Each Other, and Yosef Haddad. And then Arsen Ostrovsky, Chair and CEO of the International Legal Forum. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining me. Now, Yosef, I want to start with you because you just actually recently gave an address to Irish MPs. You know, what comes to mind when you see Mr. Barrett?
So I would like to say that Mr. Barrett and other TDs, that's what they call them, parliament members in the Irish Parliament, him and like him called to actually cancel my arrival and to speak at the Irish Parliament. Some of them even boycott that talk. And there is a reason, because they don't really want to be educated and they don't really want to know the truth about what's going on in Israel. And you literally just saw, when you see a member of the Irish Parliament speaks like this, you understand that they have no even a little bit of wanting to know the truth and knowing about it. And I asked that Irish Parliament member, and I asked him, how dare you, and tell him, how dare you to compare between the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to what's happening between between Russia and the Ukraine? How dare you to compare the 4,500 rockets launched from Gaza, from a terrorist organization, into Israel, targeting Arabs and Jews? How dare you to compare while their rockets killing Arab and Jews, and then he comes and talk about the fact that Arabs are discriminated and under apartheid regime. And I say again, if you were educated, if you would come and listen to my speak at the Irish Parliament, you wouldn't have said those things, because you would have understand that it's very far away from being the truth, because Arabs here are successful in every aspect of the Israeli society, and in every, whether if it's doctors, pharmacists, athletes, anchors, whatever you want. And the last thing, he said, I don't want to talk about the word apartheid. Don't let me speak about the word apartheid. And you know what? You're right. You shouldn't speak about the word apartheid because, one, you have no clue what is the word or the definition of apartheid means. Because if you know what the definition of apartheid means, you wouldn't even remotely hint that it's supposed to be what's going on in Israel.
He also compared Israel, of course, to Saudi Arabia. He said, don't get me started on Saudi Arabia. That's a different conversation.
You just see how much he has lack of education about this.
In your activism, how often do you come across these types of comparisons?
It's all the time there. It's all the time there, and it's basically starts from the simple fact and the simple point of that they have no knowledge about what's going on here. And only when we speak together, and I share with them the reality of the Israeli society, the reality of the Arab Israeli society, and then speak about what's going on in the West Bank and in Gaza as well, yeah, then the conversation shifts. And by the way, I didn't hear that parliament member speaking about the human rights abuse from Hamas or from the Palestinian Authority. I've never heard him calling about the death of Nizar Banat, a political activist in the West Bank, which was killed by the Palestinian Authority because he spoke out. Of course. So this is hypocrisy, pure hypocrisy.
So Arsen, I want to bring you in, again, what's your reaction to these types of comparisons, especially as a Ukrainian yourself?
Look, I think it's comparisons like this are just utterly absurd and, quite frankly, vile. I mean, I think in this day and age, there's seemingly not a single cause or tragedy that some Palestinian activists have not appropriated. It's completely absurd to compare what's happening in the Ukraine by the Russians to what we're seeing in Israel with the Palestinians. The Ukrainians have not fired 25,000 rockets at Russia. The Ukrainians have not sent suicide bombers, nor do they refuse to accept Russia's right to exist. So these comparisons are completely not only unacceptable, but they're wrong, they're absurd, they're offensive. And I would add one more thing. You only have to look at Vladimir Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine. Look at his inauguration speech in 2019, when he actually says in his speech that we, the Ukrainians, should be more like the Israelis in fighting for our freedom and territory.
So, Palestinian leaders, of course, are also joining in on these comparisons. People from the PA, officials saying that, those who condemn Russia but not Israel are hypocritical and racist because they're only more sympathetic because of color, religion, and race.
We need to understand, first of all, when we say the Palestinian Authority, we need to add the word corrupted Palestinian Authority. And this is not coming from me as an Arab who lives in Israel. That comes from people I speak with from the West Bank and obviously from Gaza. So it's Palestinians who said that. That's one. Second, this absurd comparison between what's going on. This is a political game for them. No more than that. And they have an opportunity to leverage that case and that issue between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they seize it. So now they say that the whole world is talking about how Russia invaded the Ukraine, and now they're speaking about how Ukraine and the fight and the resistance of the Ukrainians is kind of like the resistance of the Palestinian. Arsen just said right now, you can actually compare, exactly like Arsen said, you cannot really compare terrorist activities to what the Ukrainian they're doing. They're trying to defend themselves. They are trying to, even now, despite the fact that they're defending themselves, they are requesting and they want peace, which is something you will not hear from a terrorist organization like Hamas, for instance, or from the corrupted Palestinian Authority, which until today, they pay terrorists who killed Jews and Arabs, by the way, in Israel. So any type of comparison between this and this, it's just such an idiotic way to do that.
So you have corrupt Palestinian Authority officials and who are maybe speaking this way cynically, but do you think if we go back to members of, TD Barrett, for example, do you think that some of these people are maybe speaking in good faith, even if they're ignorant?
But, when you're ignorant, you have no idea what you're talking about. So I believe that he speaks from his heart, but because he is not knowledge. But when you're not knowledge, you can't really talk listen, my mother taught me one thing. If I have no idea about a subject, either teach myself, learn, educate myself, and then speak about it, or I don't want to talk about it because I would sound like an idiot. For me, right now, this Irish Parliament, he could be a doctor, he could be a professor, but when it comes to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, he's a complete idiot. That's how I see it. So my advice for him is either educate yourself, speak to me, for instance, or don't talk about it. That's it.
And I'll just add one thing, that no conflict on earth has been covered as much, so extensively, and in such detail as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You only need to sneeze in Judea and Samaria. The UN will be sending a fact-finding mission. We've had, in less than 2 weeks, 1.5 million refugees created through Russia's war against Ukraine. That is more than supposedly all the Palestinian supposed refugees since the 1940s. So it's quite, I think, a stretch of the imagination for them to say that.
I don't know, but if you include Bella Hadid as a refugee.
Or perhaps. So it's a stretch of the imagination for them to say that the media is not covering. The media has covered them ad nauseum. I think they're just a little bit jealous that all of a sudden, perhaps the world has realized, you know what, there are other matters that are far more pressing.
So that's actually something that brings me to my next question. Do you think that this type of rhetoric ultimately hurts or helps or has no effect on the Palestinian plight?
It has absolutely no effect on them whatsoever. You see, and you look at the Ukrainians, you see they're fighting for their freedom. You see that, the outrageous comparisons between the two, it does a complete disservice, I think, to the Palestinians by making these, incredible and absurd comparisons. At the end of the day, you see the Ukrainian leadership which wants peace, which yearns for peace, and you compare that with the Palestinian leadership, which today their idea of peace is paying $400 million to terrorists to kill and murder Jews who refuse to recognize our right to exist, who form government with the likes of Hamas, and who rely on Iran for their sponsorship and for their support. This is not someone that wants peace. So I think ultimately this does a great disservice to them.
It actually really hurts the cause, because eventually most of the world sees that, and I've spoke to several people, even some influencers on social media, and they told me we can't just really believe that they're comparing the Ukrainian people to a terrorist organization. That's for instance, and they feel, some of you Ukrainians that I spoke to that told me, like, I mean, come on, they're literally comparing us to Hamas, and this is something that we don't want. And in the Arab world, I can tell you that, obviously social medias who are anti-Israeli will try to elevate that as much as possible. But the simple fact is that it doesn't really change anything in the Arab world, but it does damage in the Western world when you compare the Ukrainian people to a terrorist organization. That's for sure.
All right, now, Arsen, Israel has been notoriously bad at explaining and supporting its narrative abroad, whereas the Palestinians have been working, when it comes to Pallywood and when it comes to the decades of this type of comparison, really, this propaganda, it's been quite effective. So what more can or should Israel be doing to combat this new revitalized rhetoric in this comparison?
I think Israel, in this case, is in a very sensitive situation. We inherently feel and side with the Ukrainian people who are having a war waged against them. So there's that inherent desire to side with them. But on the other hand, we do also have Syria on our border, and Russia is a key actor there. So we need to find this very fine balance. And I think that was also seen just the other day with Prime Minister Bennett having traveled to Moscow to meet with Putin, and then also with the German Chancellor on the way back, and of course speaking multiple times now with Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. So it is a tough position for us to convey to the world, not a very easy one, but we need to also, we're doing incredible on the humanitarian front. There's a hospital that's going to be set up tomorrow, and the next days.
There's a virtual hospital already set up.
Already, over 100 tons of aid that's been there. Israel is the only country that has representatives on every single border with Ukraine, helping the refugees and helping provide humanitarian aid.
And we should say also that Israel is allowing refugees to come. Some of them are non-Jews as well. Yep. So this is
according to Justice Minister Shaked, 90% are ineligible under the law of return.
Yeah. So this is an additional thing to talk about. I think one of the biggest headlines that come here when it comes to how Israel is treating the situation because of the the delicate issue with Syria is how weak the United States is and how weak the Biden administration is. Regarding to the Russia-Ukraine war, and certainly when it comes to Israel and the borders with Israel. So I think all in all, what we're trying to do is, first of all, we realize that we cannot rely on anybody else beside ourselves. That's the first and the most requested consequence of the lesson that we need to understand. That said, we need to think on the future when it comes to Iran. We cannot rely not on Russia. We cannot rely not on United States and not on any organization or EU, whatever it is in the world. Only us, only the IDF, and this is a big alert in the future when it comes to neutralize Iran from having a nuclear bomb.
He's absolutely right on that, because at the same time that the West is taking such a strong stand against Russia, it's unfathomable to think that they are sitting across the table like this, literally with the Russians in Vienna, trying to come to a deal on Iran as if it's business as usual.
Well, Russia's going one step further, and they're
even demanding.
They're demanding
from the US
sanctions
to say out,
not involve anything Iran related.
It's a matter of time. The West wants their deal so bad that, and for them, Israel is just a collateral damage.
All right, so, Mohammed Youssef of the Middle East Monitor, I recently read a piece of his on this topic. He argues that we must stop branding the Palestinian resistance as terrorism, and that the Palestinians have a legal right to fight off Israel just as Ukraine is fighting off Russia. And he gives a couple key reasons. Number one is that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza may defend against an occupying force, and he cites UNSC resolutions and articles of the UN Charter. And that second, that while not an independent state per se, Palestine meets the criteria of a state in that it is a permanent population, defined territory, has a government, and capacity to enter relations with other states. Yusuf, how do you respond?
Listen, when I see something like this, someone who writes like this, the simple fact is that they're not interested in peace in the future. They don't really even care about the fact that Israel is, exists and it's here to stay. So they're going to try to find as much as possible, sections of why the Palestinians should attack the way they attack. I mean, just this morning we heard about Palestinians go and stab 2 officers, and when the officers act and shoot him, then this is a public execute on the street. So they will find an excuse to do that. But excuse me, come on. When you launch 4,500 rockets into civilian areas, targeting Arabs and Jews, that has nothing to do with the conflict, okay? You cannot say that we cannot categorize Hamas or their reaction as not a terrorist reaction. When someone comes with a bomb to explode himself, to make a suicide bomb, whether it's in a restaurant or whether it's in a bus, you cannot say that this is a resistance and this is not a terrorist act. So people like Mohammed Youssef, I have only one thing to say to them. Keep speaking like this. Him, other like him, the reason why we're not seeing any progress in peace agreements with Israel and the Palestinians.
Arsen, I mean, again, though, if we go back to some of these UNSC resolutions, do you think, if the means of the resistance were changed, would he be right?
No, it's not right. I mean, it's 2 completely incomparable situations. I mean, first of all, legally it's completely flawed. Palestine is not a state under international law by any means, under San Remo, under the UN, under recognized international law. So take that aside, first of all. But no, look, you cannot, and as Yosef just said very clearly, it's no such thing as a legitimate resistance by putting a suicide vest and going into a shopping mall.
So that's what I mean. I mean, if the means of the resistance were different, would Mohammed Youssef have an argument?
No, I don't think it would have an argument in that case either. I mean, it would be maybe a different argument, but no, it wouldn't have any added validity to it because I don't think, you're talking about, well, do they have a justified right to respond in such a manner? Well, no, I don't believe they do. But is it better than the violent means which they've used up to now? Then obviously that's a very different situation.
And I just wanted to add that I believe that everything, just like obviously in the past and in the future, when it comes in the right way and with the right intention, I would say that the best way to end this conflict is by just mutual agreement. And it's possible. We've tried it in the past, and in the past, the failure came from the Palestinian side. It started way back in 1946, when the Arab leaders refused to accept the partition plan. It went on and on from every deal, including the one with the former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and then the Trump deal, and probably in the future as well. So we've seen that time after time that the Palestinian leaders refused and rejected any peace agreement because all of those agreements has one critical section, which means recognizing Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which in all of those, this is the one thing that most of them are not accepting, especially Hamas. So when you come to ask or to state something like this, you should just ask yourself, do they really want peace? Do they really want to achieve something? And unfortunately, right now, the leaders of the corrupted Palestinian Authority, and especially the leaders of Hamas, the terrorist organization, this is the last thing that they want to do. So he has no point here.
At the end of the day, peace will come through dialogue, not through Hamas rockets or boycotts. Simple as that.
100%.
So, all right, again, coming back to these comparisons, this rhetoric, it seems like it's the latest, maybe cynical or bastardized use of the concept of intersectionality, which I think has been a growing concept or policy, especially in the West. Is intersectionality a good policy full stop? Is it a good policy that's being used too liberally and even cynically? Or is it maybe too broad a policy to begin with, making it too easy to obfuscate real issues?
I think in principle, it's a good idea. It's a good concept because I think when we have such issues, such pressing issues facing society that really intertwine many causes, many groups, many kinds of thought, I think it's necessary for us to come together. So I think in principle, it's a positive thing. But when it becomes politicized, when it becomes used as a weapon,
political?
It doesn't have to be. It can also, when you see groups coming together to affect positive change, that's a good thing. But when you see them coming together to politicizing it, to weaponizing it against Israel, against the Jews, then obviously that becomes something very disconcerting, something we've seen, especially in the US with various intersectionality, various causes coming together, whether it's women's rights marches or the Black Lives Matter movement to try and sort of be, to appropriate those causes as a facade in order to attack Israel. That's when it becomes problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my final question then is, are we right to be addressing this issue in the way that we are, or are we playing into the hands of anti-Israel cynics really by giving this voice, by giving this a platform?
Listen, I know that there's a lot of people who would say that, we shouldn't engage that, we shouldn't be a player in that cause or their cause. My perspective is completely different, because 70 years we tried to play the, we apologize, maybe you're right, or you know what, you're not right, but listen to me, here's the thing. So we're trying to be apologetic and nice, and I'm not going to do that. You lie, I'm going to tell you that you're a liar. You twist the facts, I'm going to bring the facts, I'm going to show you how you twisted the facts. And when you use something like this to compare the Russian-Ukraine war to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I'm going to be in the front line telling you how it's idiotic and attack you back. That's how I believe.
That's the final word.
Look, it's a fine line. You don't want to give them any more air than they deserve, and they don't deserve any air at all. On the other hand, these are serious allegations that do have broader ramifications in parliaments around the world, at UN bodies, and in discussions among civil society. So we do also need to find a way to address them, but to address them in a responsible manner.
All right, so unfortunately, I'd love to continue talking about this forever with you guys, but Arsen, Youssef, thank you so much for coming in today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And of course, everybody watching at home, thank you for joining us. I'm Aaron Porras, and please tune in next time on Insider for more of everything Israel. If there's a topic that you'd like us to cover next, let us know about it in the comment sections online. And finally, for more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv and sign up for our brand new streaming platform, ILTV+. Thank you so much. Be well, and we'll see you soon.